All right. And I'm going to turn it over to Roxy, who's going to introduce some very special colleagues and friends today who are going to present for us on the chat. So Roxy.
All right, well, thanks. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce the trio who are going to be presenting today. I'll start with Sarah. Sarah's a former high school teacher in the Milwaukee area, where I think that's where she first connected up with Henry. And she's done a lot of consulting in high schools, and she's currently the high school specialist for the Mathematics Institute of Wisconsin, which is a project funded by the Brook Hill Foundation. And in that capacity, she works as a consultant for schools in Wisconsin and Illinois, and has a lot of experience doing workshops and working with teachers. Henry is a retired, like many of us now, retired math stat high school teacher from Wisconsin. He's really been very active at NCTM and in fact filled in for Hank Kepner when he was the NCTM president. And one of the things that I've always appreciated about Pat is that he was one of the really early advocates for statistics education within the mathematics education community, and did a lot to kind of move the cause for statistics education forward. He's been the co-author along with Henry and Pat, co-author on the data-driven mathematics, the Engage New York mathematics curriculum, Bridging the Gap, and several other initiatives in Wisconsin. So he's had his hand in many of the projects that I think some of you are familiar with. Henry is a retired high school teacher and a college teacher. He's worked for over 50 years as a teacher. He shared that with me, so I figured he was okay with me saying 50 years as a teacher. Many of those years were spent at Rufus King High School in Milwaukee, and then the last 14 or 15 years he was the math specialist for the EOP program at Marquette, and also taught intro stat for them at Marquette University. And Henry, I can't even remember when I first met Henry. It seems like I've known him forever. I think it might have been when NCTM put us together for a project many years ago. So I've worked with Henry on a lot of projects. He's one of my go-to people when I'm putting a team of people together. And he always brings, he's very creative and always brings really great ideas to the table. And so his two latest projects are People Counts, which I encourage you to take a look at if you aren't familiar with that. And then the one that they're going to be talking about today, which is Focus on Statistics, Investigations for Integrating Statistics into the grades 9 through 12 mathematics classroom. And we're happy both Pat and Henry have grandchildren that are competing for their time these days, and so we're happy that they still find some time to work on these projects and continue to be involved with the ASA and CTM Joint Committee, as they have been over decades now. So anyway, I'll turn it over to Pat, Henry, and Sarah.
Thanks. Sarah, are you gonna? Okay. All right, so good afternoon, everybody. I'm Pat Hoffensberger, and thank you, Roxy. I appreciate your kind words. We're going to take our time this afternoon, and myself, Sarah, and Henry are going to kind of walk you through this book, which can now be downloaded. So here's sort of our goals for the session. What I'd like to do is to, first of all, just go through and give you an overview of the 6 sections that we've divided the focus on statistics and the sort of the structure of each one. Then I'm going to take one investigation and take a little bit deeper look at it, but to give you a little bit more of an idea of how everything is orientated and set up for you as a teacher. And then I'd like to sort of finish up with taking a look at just pulling out a couple of the other investigations and give you a quick picture of what they look like. Please, at any time, if you have questions, just ask. That's probably the best way to do this, even though we will leave time at the end to sort of questions just in general. So our first sort of step was, as we started to plan this project, who is our intended audience. And as you can see on the slide there, our intended audience was really mathematics teachers in grades 8 to 12. Now, the cover of the book says grades 9 to 12, but the idea is that there are a lot of school districts where algebra is being taught at the 8th grade, and there are 8th graders involved already in the high school curriculum. And so that's the reason for the 8. As I just mentioned, the students, any student that's in sort of a pre-algebra, algebra 1, algebra 2, advanced algebra, up through pre-calculus, and then with all of the integrated courses, I think this would fit nicely into any one of those courses also. Sarah's going to show you just quickly, we're going to just show you where the book can be downloaded. And so if you go to the statistics teacher website, this is what it looks like. And as you go down the page, here is focus on statistics. And as you can see, it can be purchased from Amazon, but it also can be downloaded. You can do the complete book or each one of the different sections. And I'm going to go through the sections in just a moment. And then toward the bottom, you'll notice that all of the worksheets that are put together, they are either in a PDF or in a Word document. And just to let you know, if you download as a Word document, you have permission to make all the changes that you want. So if you read through it and say, I really don't need to do this section, that's fine, okay? So to take a look at each of the, quick overview of each of the sections. So there are 6 sections as we put this together. The first one we call Getting Started, but it is really an investigation looking at the idea of statistical questions. And I'll go a little bit more in depth in just a minute. The second section is one variable data analysis. Investigations 1 through 3, and then there's a investigation 4 that's open-ended. Section 3 is where we do 2 variable analysis. There are only 5 or 6 investigations here, but this is probably the most intense part of the focus. The first part of it is on scatter plots and looking at correlation and least squares regression. The second half is on the 2 variable categorical data analysis, where the last lesson actually gets into the idea of independence. Section 4 is on probability. We look at probability distributions, the normal distribution, and also expected value. Section 5 is on inference, and where we look at proportions and also means. And then the last section is teacher resources, just an overview of what's available through ASA in terms of either online or other services that are offered. In terms of where we would see this focus on statistics fitting, is a little bit more in-depth information in. So the first section, different types of questions used throughout the statistical problem solving. It takes you really through a really nice lesson in terms of how do you get your students involved in asking questions and ultimately really trying to write a really well-written investigative question, one that we can answer with data. You'll see examples of that as we go on this afternoon, but I just want to point out that we really encourage the students to come up with the question and to really take a look at, so what is a good question? And one that, again, can be answered with data. As I mentioned, for section 2, in the first 4 lessons there, it's really looking at dot plots, box plots used to display data. I will tell you that we don't say how to make a box plot. We are making an assumption that the kids would come in, your students would come in with that knowledge. So if they don't, you would have to take a little extra time to teach how to do those kinds of things. Our big focus here is trying to get the kids to look at and comparing multiple sets of data. In middle school, they would have looked probably at one set and looked at center shape and spread, where here we want multiple, and we have at least, in many cases, 2 or 3 sets of data that the kids would collect or we have available, where the kids then would build these different plots and to try to compare. Also here is where we develop the idea of standard deviation. In section 3 is, as I mentioned just a minute ago, the first half is on the idea of using quantitative data and looking concept of correlation, least squares regression. We look at residuals. And the second part is looking at the idea of association between two categorical variables. We do eventually get to the idea of investigating the idea of when are two events independent. This second part for many students is a very difficult part, and I'll highlight that also a little bit later on. Section 4 on probability. This has 3 investigations. We start off with looking at a probability distribution. I'll show you an example of that in a minute. The idea of developing the idea of expected value, and then finishing up with looking at the normal distribution. In section 5, inference, there are 4 lessons there. The first one is looking at sampling distribution of sample proportions, then testing a claim about a proportion, and then the sort of the last 2 investigations are really developing a confidence interval through using bootstrapping. The 18th lesson is another open-ended one, which I'll talk about in just a minute. And as I mentioned, section 6 is on teacher resources, and you'll notice just the list. I know in the past, some of these sessions, if you looked at Census at School, we use that site quite often in many of our investigations, having as one means for kids to collect data. The other part then, before we move in and look at lessons, is where would they fit? So if you're teaching, depending on what course you're teaching at the high school level, so if your book has an introduction to statistics, the first 4 lessons would fit nicely. In the algebra book where you're doing linear functions, there's 3 or 4 lessons that you could do, investigations you could use there. The unit after linear functions, investigations 9 and 10. As we move up the line a little bit, for linear functions, again, lessons 5 through 8. And you can sort of see the probability unit. If you have one in your book, which many books do now, we would offer sections or investigations 12 to 14. And then after the students have done the probability unit is when they might then look at the idea of inference. And again, you may be looking at a little bit more upper level group of kids at that point. In the early part of the focus on statistics, each of the investigations we do, I know you've had presentations on the gaze level, so I'm not going to go into that, but we do give you an idea as a teacher what level of where the students should be in order to be engaged in this unit. We do suggest grade levels. We do match it up with the Common Core standards. We also match up each investigation with the mathematical practices through a statistical lens, which is also available at the ASA website. And we also did some matching with one of NCTM's recent publications to so where would our investigations fit into their essential concepts from the NCTM standpoint. As I mentioned just briefly, the sort of each end of at the end of section 2, 3, and 4, and 5 in there, we do offer some very open-ended investigations. Investigation 4 would come at the end of that one variable analysis, and we called it, do you have too much homework? And again, this is where students would be either collecting some data or they could go to Census at School and using some data from there. Investigation 8 is how long to topple dominoes. And again, it's an experiment that kids would run. And then investigation 8, which I'll mention a little bit more at toward the end, is how stressed are you? And it's an investigation where students from maybe your school district or the United States, and how do they compare to students in New Zealand in terms of how stressed they feel? Interesting topic considering where we are now with COVID and everything. The next sort of step is what does each investigation sort of look like, if you will. And as you can see, here's just one that I pulled out in terms of investigation 3, how good is your memory? We start off with an overview. So the overview really is designed to say, okay, here's maybe where the students have been. This is what we would like to have this investigation take students to just give you, as a teacher, sort of a general, where does it sort of fit in the students' continuum as they're growing. Then we have what we call an instructional plan. The instructional plan first has a brief overview. So if you're sometimes like me and you think, oh, I'm not going to read this whole lesson, all I want is a quick overview of what's going to happen here. That's what this first part is. So there's bullets in terms of, all right, here are the 4 or 5 big steps that you're going to be asking your students to do. Each of the instructional plan does follow the GAZE statistical problem solving steps. So each one, the first would be formulate a statistical question, collect appropriate data, analyze the data, and interpret the results. And as you can see, as we go through a lesson, all of the lessons fit into that sort of process. In addition to that, another part of the early material for a teacher is we do have the learning goals. So what are we expecting of students? Then we have the mathematical practices through the statistical lens. There's a match. And then we have, in many cases, some cases, a rather extended list of what do you need as a teacher to implement this lesson. So if it's computers or any kind of software that you might need, we'll talk a little bit more about worksheets, but you can see in this particular lesson, there were actually 5 worksheets that we put together. Some of you wouldn't use, some of them you might use. And it's really more going to be, as the classroom teacher, how much direction do you need for your students? We give an idea of how long the lesson would take. We did it in terms of 50-minute class periods. I know you may be under a 70-minute period or something, but this just gives you an idea of about how much time we think it would take to completely do the lesson as it's written. And then the pre-knowledge, which again, I think is important, is as a teacher, when we wrote this, what do we expect students to be coming into this lesson with? And here's just one of those ideas. The next step, or I should say the next step, the last part of each lesson, we also have a exit ticket. That's what we were using. And so is when the students, when you're finished with the lesson, here's it's usually 1, 2, or 3 questions. I suppose you could use it at homework, or you could use it as they leave, in the last 10 minutes of class, just to see, is everybody with you in terms of meeting those learning goals that we've set. The final part of each investigation then is we have further investigations or extensions. Further investigations give you an idea of, well, if you did this and your students need a little bit more, here's where you might go. Extensions, in some cases, here's where we get into the little bit more of a theory. If you're an AP Stat teacher, it may be here's where we present all the formulas, for example. As we move forward then, just to go a little bit more in depth, so the instructional plan. We start each instructional plan with what I call the scenario. And it just sort of sets up the lesson. As you as a teacher would come into and say, hey, today what do you think about this? Or just to get the kids to start thinking about I use the term scenario again, but to begin to think about this process and really getting them to start to think about what questions might I ask? And I think that's the key thing with the scenario. Setting it up, hopefully the scenarios are of interest to the students. In many cases, I think the answer is yes, but who knows? And then once you sort of leave that scenario, then we get into the little bit more of that writing that statistical question. And again, this question that we're going to be able to answer with data. And if you notice that last step, we want to be able to come back to that question. And it's really important that the students are expected to use their summary, that analysis that they did, to write an answer to the statistical question. And I emphasize the word write because we do in many cases ask the students to write a paragraph. Here's what I think the answer, and here's why, and back it up with the analysis of the data. Let's go back quickly to the collection of data. In almost all of the lessons, I understand sometimes time can be a huge concern. We do provide data with each investigation. That is all student generated or is data from census at school, for example. And but we do encourage the lesson can easily, in fact, we encourage that the data is collected by your students, whether it's measurement data that they take in class, it's doing a simulation in class, or it's going to census at school and collecting the data that way. So I just wanted to point that out, that we do have data sets there for you to use if needed. The next sort of step then is, Sarah, do you want to jump forward? Okay, and then I mentioned about the student worksheets. Again, they can be downloaded. The main student worksheet, and I'll use it to term that way, I'll show you an example in just a minute, are really a series of questions. Many of the lessons are written to really encourage that the students are working in groups, whether it's groups of 2, 3, or 4, and the worksheet is really designed to help the students go through this 4-step statistical problem-solving process. There's some leading questions, and again, as the teacher, you might say, you know what, my students don't need that, or I might use it, but we really encourage, the idea is to sort of, that should be student working on this rather than the individual teacher standing up with this and just reading the questions. Okay, kids, now do a dot plot. Okay, now do a box plot. Okay, now do, and rather than have the kids sort of say, what graph would be the best for this situation? As I mentioned, the worksheets also could include possible data. And again, when you go to the statistics teacher website, there's where it can be downloaded either as a PDF, which means you probably can't change much, or the Word documents. And I want to emphasize, you can change those worksheets to suit your particular classroom and your students. So encourage that part of it. When you download the worksheets, when you go to that, you're going to see this is how they're going to say, so what does all that mean? So if you notice the top one up there where it says 9 WK, so this would mean it's investigation 9, worksheet 9.3. And Sarah, can we jump back a couple slides where we show the one where it has all of the what's in each lesson? And I just wanted to point out, back about 3 or 4 slides. No, the one that has the gray area, which, yeah. So I'm sorry to do this, but if you'll notice on there where it says materials, this gives you an idea. So worksheet 3.1, if you said, you know what, I really don't need the directions. So, well, then when you download, don't download that one. Worksheet 3.2. If you were not using the data that's provided, you wouldn't need that worksheet. Here, again, there's where the data, if you didn't want, you could use this data set. In this case, worksheet 3.3 is the investigation. This is the one that we would really probably encourage that you would use. This is the one that's really for student to go through the 4-step process. You'll notice I have an optional one there. If you didn't want your students to actually do this memory test, then you would download that one. This one, we also have a separate worksheet, maybe use as homework, for example, or as just as a summary for the end, and also the exit ticket. Thanks, Sarah. So then we can jump ahead then to the goals one. Okay, so that's a real quick overview of the 6 sections. and sort of what the format for each of the investigation looks like. So now I'd like to just take a look at one of the investigations, just a little bit more in depth, to give you a little better idea of, so if I'm going to teach this lesson, what might it look like? So I've just picked one that I just highlighted just a minute ago. So we're going to just quickly look at investigation 3. And so here's, this is one of my favorite ones, to be honest with you. It's kind of a fun one. How good is your memory? And so this is not the whole scenario, but I just want to give you an idea of what, as you came into class, what would this, hey, do you remember ever playing that memory game? In fact, when I did this, I actually brought the game. We still had it from when my kids were little. We still had that game. So I brought it in. Oh, and a lot of the students remembered. Oh, I remember doing that. And then how long did you think you could take to match all the cards? Do you think you could do better than a group of 4th graders? So this is just sort of getting the kids to think about what are some data I could collect? What kinds of things might I do? And then we move into a little bit more of a formal, and that is, what is the statistical question? In each of the investigations, we do provide a statistical question that the lesson is written around. But again, I want to emphasize that out of that scenario, if your students were to say, well, why don't we play the game and see how long it takes? And maybe this is 1st hour, and maybe 7th hour could play it, and we'll compare those two. Great. You can still follow along in the lesson, but the idea is that the kids have sort of come up with this. So for this one is, how do the memory test completion times of our class compare to the memory test completion times for 4th graders from around the country? That's the question that we are going to investigate then as we move forward. So the next step then would be to collect data. And here again is where we use census at school. So this is, well, Sarah will just show you quickly what it looks like. We're not going to play the game. I suppose we could, but so the game is you click start, and then you click, and you just keep clicking until you find all the matches, and you'll notice that it's keeping time of how long it takes you to do it. My students thought this was awful. They just, well, can we play it again? Can we play it again? So when they're finished, they have a set amount of time. So we would then collect that data, and that's then where the students, we could collect it on the board, the kids could write it down, and that's when we then put them in their groups, and they would begin that process of the analysis of that data. So then that step is, for instance, I'm just showing you an example. Here is what we would encourage the students to do. Since the question was a comparison, we want the kids to make, in this case, 2 dot plots. You could do two box plots, and have the kids kind of look and say, well, can you describe the 9th graders? Again, this is the CAN data. Your students might look very different versus the 4th graders. And we want the kids to talk about the center. We talk about the shape. This lesson 3, which I'm not going at, this really lesson was designed to introduce the idea of standard deviation. So this would take, we would expect the kids in their analysis to take a look at the idea of not only center and shape, but standard deviation and the effect that, for example, this outlier has on that. The last step then is, again, I think maybe, well, here's an example of what the part of the worksheet would look like. So this is, again, if you felt the need that your students need some direction, this would be a possibility that you could use. So it sort of takes the kids in groups, help answer the question, construct the dot plot, and then so forth. And then have the kids discuss and describe that distribution. So the idea really here is, again, we wanted to make sure as a classroom teacher, you had a resource available depending on how much help your students need. You would know your students better than we would. And again, some groups of kids wouldn't need this at all. You would just sort of open them up and let them go with that. As we go forward then, the last step, and as I said, it's really important to have the kids finish up with answering the question, to write a summary. So we would expect them to say and talk about the calculations that they've done And here's a case. In some cases, I know teachers who have had the kids, they can do a 5-minute little summary, stand up in front of their group and so forth. So this is really key. I will tell you that a lot of kids, this is a struggle to begin with. But as you do more of these investigations, this becomes, they become pretty good at this in terms of thinking about how am I going to answer that question using the process that I've already gone through. So then here's an example of one question from the exit ticket. So again, this whole lesson was designed to compare two groups, particularly looking at measures of, particularly looking at standard deviation. And so here's an example of a question where you would have the students before they left class that day, maybe as they came into class the next day, or you use this as homework. This would be an idea of what sort of expectations we would have for students. So now let me just take a very brief look at it. Just two other investigations, just a very quick, what else would you see as we move forward? So the next one.
Pause for a minute just to see if we had any questions.
Please.
That's all. I was just going to see if anybody had any questions before I move to this last chunk.
Thank you, Sarah. Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. In terms of so that last one that you saw was sort of an overview of the second section on analyzing one variable sort of data. In section 3 is where I talked about earlier, there's really two very distinct sections really parts in this section. First part is two variable quantitative, and then the second part is two variable categorical data. So Henry, do you want to just take a minute and talk just a little bit about that?
Sure.
Lessons really 9, 10, and 11 kind of go
Right.
together.
Right, and thank you. Let's see once. Do I have to do anything special so you see me?
No,
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. This sometimes is called sort of my Rufus King High School memoirs. We've had many a survey project, and I put together several of the questions that my students constructed in various investigations that we wanted to do about the school. So these are actual questions constructed primarily by students, and the data that goes along with this, with a little exceptions here and there, was intended to give you a sense of how students answered those questions. This particular investigation actually is intended for students to work with categorical data. I will admit, this was a challenging book to write. We tried to work closely with the Joint Committee, the ASA and NCTM committee, as they asked us to incorporate many of the components that Pat alluded to, meaning the connections to GAZE and also to the Common Core, but also a good range of what students will encounter. What I found as a teacher, and I'll just make this as sort of my little editorial comment, is it seemed that students, when given the task of actually working on collecting data on their own, often encountered the fact that what they wanted was categorical data. So this lesson was intended to really be specific about what that was, and then to be somewhat aware of, so what do we do with this? This is a different kind of data. It isn't like the numerical data that we summarized in the previous lessons. Jerry Marino is on board, and I want to just highlight or mention that he worked really hard with me on this lesson, investigation 10 and 11. We found, as we were putting this together, that sometimes the terminology that is used to describe what is going on with this kind of data is not real precise. Jerry, maybe you want to comment too on this, but I have an email from you that I uncovered not too long ago where you were mentioning how some of the textbooks that you looked at and some of the previous work weren't always the same on this. We tried to be consistent with what we were trying to do here. So anyway, if that's appropriate, please chime in. But Jerry helped us real diligently to put together, I think, a solid job on this, and I'm quite proud of what came out of this. Investigation 9 proposes these questions. Sarah, can we see the data on how this actually looks? Here is, which is one of the worksheets, the various responses that students gave that I tried to assemble. The first part is, you know what? One question, you can't really do much more than to summarize maybe how students, what percent answered the most to one of these categories or the least, and possibly could this survey sample of the survey be similar to the whole population. Where we move from this is into investigation 10 and 11, where we're putting two surveys together, or two questions together, and this is where the two-way tables start coming out. Some of these questions were maybe a little trite, so to speak, because I did let students have a pretty strong handle in doing this, but it didn't take long for students to really start trying to figure out, and that's where this lesson 10 is going. Is there a difference between one of the categories and the other? In other words, is there a difference between a major difference that you can note in percentage between those who are in athletic programs that spend time outdoors or those that are not? And interpreting that and putting those two questions together started to create some real interest and real combinations of different questions here. Pat alluded to the fact that if you don't like the questions we selected or I used here, you certainly can go to Census at School. The bigger encouragement was so for students in your school to maybe create their own questions to collect their own data. I'm not sure if Kevin Reeves is still on board, but
yeah, he is, right.
Yeah, Kevin might have a quick chance, and it probably has to be short, Kevin, because there's other questions we want to address, but if he has a chance, his school put together surveys and did a lot of this two-way table work to summarize the results in that. Kevin, do you want to mention maybe some of the questions that your students explored that were in this type of data collection?
Yeah, sure. So I was working with some credit deficient kids and created an intro to stats course this school year, combating the administrative desire to have pre-algebra be the name of the course. I really advocated that these kids could and should get some stats. So they paired up with an administrator, found out about the administrator's job, and then through that administrator developed a statistical question and then created survey questions to help that administrator or school board member with their job. So the superintendent was interested in why do students fail? Why are they failing classes? So they surveyed how many hours of sleep do you get? Do you have an after-school job? Are you involved in after-school activities? The superintendent was expecting kids that work jobs were gonna not do as well in school because they were not studying as much. And it was actually, there was just a slight association. So the kids were able to use that terminology with the superintendent present and kind of diminish his preconceived thoughts on that. The school board member, I thought one of the most powerful things that happened was a school board member wanted to know if we were preparing kids for their after school plans. So one of the two-way tables was, are you entering the workforce or going to college? And the other question was yes or no, is our school preparing you for that? And it was something like 80%, I think, of the students that were college bound felt that the teachers, the coursework was preparing them, and it was under 20% felt that they were being prepared if they weren't going to college. So I think that speaks a lot to the career and college readiness
Wow.
that's out there. So It was a random sample of 90 students. They didn't get a very good response rate, but still, I thought that was very telling, and the adults in the room wanted to turn and talk. They wanted to pause the whole presentation because that result was powerful. Our curriculum director also was interested in what's impacting students' GPA, and asked about hours of sleep again and how they use their study hall and how many study halls they have. I had we have this time at the end. Our mascot's the trucker. So at the end of the day, we have this time called trucker time, a resource time where students can go get help from teachers, or go get enrichments, or just use it as a study hall. It's meant to be academic, and probably my biggest, lowest achieving prior to this class kid, maybe my biggest success story, right? Hasn't been successful in other math classes. His presentation was great. And he surveyed kids about how they were using trucker time at the end of the day. And overwhelmingly, students were using it for social reasons, or video games, or things that aren't on the list to do, or just leaving campus and not using that. So that caused quite a stir among the adults too. And now they're having meetings about how we're going to reformat that time, maybe a different time of day, different expectations for the students, different expectations for staff. So as a staff member, we might not even like it. Classic things happen. They use the word correlation. It was segmented bar graphs, and the stats teacher and me wanted to jump over the table, but I kind of let it go, right? You got to let it go. And they were getting adults to talk about this, and adults to ask more questions, and adults to take those questions to their adult meetings. So I thought that's a win. Even though they misused correlation, it's a win. Can't win them all at the same time. And the last one was athletic director, and he wanted to know why we have really low participation right now, a lot of school spirit that's lacking, and he had some questions too. So those are the types of questions that the kids want.
One of the things that came out of trying to do this, that you sparked some comment from me, is not all of us are in schools in which distributing a survey is even allowable. There are some schools, and I know, in which the administration would say, no, you can't survey everybody, or they would really, really put some close scrutiny to what the questions are. So we provide the data, and you can do that. But if you have a chance to have kids actually put together a survey and collect it, I think some of the results that Kevin mentioned are apparent. And what you did, Kevin, that I think is important here is that connection to involving the adults right off the bat made it more workable for the administration to actually allow that to happen. And look at the results. And it was quite impressive to see students who Kevin described as not necessarily your most math intended kids present in a very passionate way. So I don't know, Pat, do you want me to go on a little bit?
No, we're getting close to we should probably finish up,
Yep.
huh?
Gotcha.
Otherwise, yes. Okay, so I'll just quickly finish up so we have questions. I just wanted to highlight section 4 was the probability one. This is another fun activity for kids to develop a probability distribution. And the idea here is, Sarah, let's just go to the next slide right away. The idea is to say, if there are 6 people living in an apartment building, and what's the chance that all 6 will get the flu? And the whole idea here is they had the kids roll a die. So in this case right here, person 1 started with the flu. They bumped into person 4, 4 got it. And then they randomly bumped into 6, 6 got it. But the next day, 6 randomly bumped into 3, but 3 already had it, so couldn't get it again. So then it finished. And so then, and the next slide then is where we have the kids collect the data, rolling die and randomly taking a look at things to build a probability distribution and to begin to talk about that a little bit. And then the last one real quick that I just wanted to mention was investigation 17. This one is where we develop confidence intervals through the bootstrapping. The reason I want to finish up with this one is that the data came from Census at School, and there are 50 pieces of data. These are students that said, how many hours do they volunteer a year? And so let's back up just for a minute, Sarah, I'm sorry. And so here is that graph that you see. So we have some kids that are all down I don't hardly do any, to some kids that are doing over 500 hours every year. And so we wanted to take a look at using that data and developing a confidence interval for the true mean number of hours that students volunteer. So what we did is one of the worksheets has all 50 times on it. And we really want the kids to take those 50 times. You can put them on a card, a piece of paper, put them in a paper bag, and they draw out a random sample of 50 with replacement. And so then what they do is they take their sample of 50 with replacement and they find the mean. They then report that mean. And so the next slide is what a group of students did in terms of that. Here is the means that those students got when they took a sample of 50. And I think it was important that the students did that by hand, so they get an idea of what it meant to do this with replacement. Back to kids, when I first did this, the kids would say, well, we're just going to get the same ones. Well, remember, we're putting that back in, we can collect that same one again. So they were a little surprised at the variability that was here. But I think at this time then to turn to technology. We haven't mentioned much about technology, but here's a fine example of, so I can run this 1,000 times and you start to get an idea of what it would look like, and then find the 95% confidence interval if you wanted to. We have throughout the investigations, we do encourage the use of technology, whether it's using one of the TI graphing calculators or any other software that you might have. Anything is appropriate, but we also think there's a time where first the kids ought to be sort of getting their hands dirty with the data, messing with it before they turn to that technology. And then the last thing I just want to mention real quick, and then I think we'll have a few minutes for questions, is just sort of a reminder. And this one right here, the last investigation is really very open-ended. Investigation 18 is the one I mentioned at the start of our thing today, is where the kids have this option, and they, again, wide open, where they could look at topics as Henry was just talking about and Kevin were just talking about. I think this is just, and what we have as option one is for you as a teacher to take you through what are some steps necessary to help your students sort of design a question and so forth, to give you help. If you wanted to, you again could go to Census at School and use data from there to compare how do kids in the United States feel in terms of how their stress versus kids in New Zealand. And I'll let you look at that lesson to see if you can find the answer to that question. So there sort of was our goals for this afternoon. I would now just really open it up if there's any questions, if anybody has any comments, I would appreciate them. I'll leave it open-ended then. Or Sarah or Henry, any comments? Anything to add?
Well, I would like to just add quickly that I really would like to thank ASA and NCTM, the Joint Committee, for putting on this project. As I mentioned, it was not an easy book to write, yet I think that their diligence in keeping it focused, as the title puts it, was a good one. Anyway, they did a nice job. They did a beautiful job on the production of the book. Makes it relatively workable, I think. And then behind the scenes, having a professional statistician and awesome teacher, Jerry Marino, both correcting us and giving us suggestions in a very kind way was very appreciative. So thanks to ASA and
Thank you, Henry,
for doing that.
Thank you, Henry, for saying that. Sarah, I noticed that a couple people asked about the link, so maybe we could go back and just show the link that page where it shows where everything is, the stat teacher. Yeah, so here is the link for those of you who missed the early part, which is fine. Statisticsteacher.org, and there you'll find all the material. Again, free download, or it can be purchased. You can do the whole book. You can do just certain sections, and the worksheets again are there for you to use and modify if you so desire. Any additions? Or again, I just want to, I would like to, again, thank you, Henry, for saying what you did. I really appreciate that. And likewise, I also want to say thank you to everybody for your time this afternoon. I appreciate it. And
I was just going to add one thing.
yeah, please.
I think one of the things that Pat, Henry, and I were really thinking about as we were designing these materials is that these materials are not designed for an AP Stat teacher.
Oh, thank you.
These materials are, and I'm not sure how many AP Stat teachers we have on tonight, right? But they're really designed for your colleagues who don't teach AP Stat and maybe don't have a background or any background in statistics, yet we have standards in our grades 9, 10, and 11 courses that are statistics standards. So these materials were really designed to not only offer some activities for students to engage in, but also to be very supportive to the teacher who may not have a background in this area to really make sense of and understand the content that they're doing, especially if they don't have any formal training in that area or have never taught a stat course, right? For many teachers, you may not have had any training, maybe one college course in stat, if that, depending on the state you live in. So if you're trying to teach these standards, it might be a bit of a struggle for you content-wise if you don't have experience there. And so all of our materials also have sample student responses, and they're sample responses, not as in these are actual responses we are hoping to get from high school students, but really a bit of a more formal thing to really tell you a little bit more about what you're looking for. So these materials really designed not for AP Stat, but for your grades 9, 10, and 11 courses, and to support those teachers who may not have the background for it or who haven't taught it before.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Henry, for your comments. And it was a real pleasure working with these three really talented and creative teachers. I enjoyed our time together very much. I've known Henry and Pat for a long time, back in the QL days of the early 90s, and had a pleasure meeting Sarah and working with her as well. It was good job, guys. A good presentation today.
And then Jerry, I'd also add, you were nice enough to give us names of high school teachers who were also our critics, and they did an outstanding job also. So a couple of very talented teachers in your area, in the Cleveland area, who were also great help to us. Yeah.
Welcome.
I just wanted to say what a great pleasure it's been for me in years past to be able to work with these, I should say 4 individuals, including Jerry. I've been at some of their professional developments with teachers, you know, spending a week or more, and I learned so much. They are just tremendous. And I think ASA and NCTM were so grateful when they agreed to write this book, but also many of the other resources that they've written for ASA and NCTM as well. So this is not the only resource you can find at our website that they've been involved in. And so I just feel very fortunate that I've been able to know them all these years and learn from them myself.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.
We could put a, Henry, we could put a plug in for that's a statistical studies, still have it on my, and actually the other one is Bridging the Gap. So there's really 3 sets of material. Bridging the Gap, which really is 1st grade through 8th grade. This set of material focus on statistics, 8, 9 grade through 12. But then this is really another a resource for classroom teachers to really help kids understand, as we were talking about, how do we get kids to think about doing that survey and all of those kinds of things, setting it up. So I think there's 3 very good resources for high school, middle school, high school teachers that they can use to really emphasize statistics in their classroom.
And the MSSS resource that you just put up there was definitely a major work by Roxy. So thank her for many of those lessons. And there's one lesson in there, Roxy, that I have to admit I do every chance I get with my introductory college students. And that's the lesson about the responsible teenager. We get a lot of comments on that one. So there's a very good survey related lesson in there too.
Good. Thank you. Well, anyway, thanks everyone. Chris, is it time?
I was
or
just going to
next?
see, is there any
Okay.
other questions or
Yeah.
comments? I think everyone was really impressed with your presentation today. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
I just am so excited that this resource is now free online to where teachers can easily use it. I know we plan on using it down here in Georgia as we're
Good.
developing some resources for our new standards here in statistics in Georgia. So I'm very excited about that. I just wanted to mention that for our further chats starting in February, we're probably going to move our day to Wednesday instead of Thursday. So for the remainder of the school year, we'll try a different day, and you'll be getting a notice within just a few weeks of our next chat once February rolls around, which will probably be here sooner than we know it. But thank you again for joining us today. And thank you again to Pat, Henry, Sarah, and Jerry for what you did with this book and for being willing to come and present with us today.
Thanks, Chris.
All right. So
Take
until the next chat, have a
Okay.
good month and good start to the school year.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Chris, any comments or anything? Are you still recording?
I'm